platforms. Can I get a pair of platforms? Oh, that's so retro. We were wearing platforms in the 70s. Honey, we were wearing those in the 30s and 40s. Which, please. So we've all heard the saying, everything old is new again. And maybe you've even heard the phrase, there's nothing new in fashion. But did you know that playing off of old fashions and making them new again is a practice that goes way beyond wearing your grandmother's platforms or clutching your pearls in horror when you see the kids wearing tattoo necklaces? Like, of all of the trends to come back in fashion, why this one? In fact, this practice goes back hundreds, nay, thousands of years in some cases. And it's sometimes hilarious to see which trends come back into the trendy mindset. Hi, I'm Jackie with an I, and normally we make things on this channel, but since I'm a little burnt out after making this monster, and since we all need to laugh a little these days, let's explore some of my favorite reoccurring fashion trends. And perhaps we can figure out what was going on in that one particular decade where every century everyone was just like, well, okay, time to make our asses big again. But before we get to that one, let's go back and talk about those platform-wearing courtesans. Whew, that rough was rough, y'all. Somebody needs to starch it again. Today, celebrities sport platforms all over the place, but we all probably remember at least one time where platforms were the shoe to wear. Thanks to pop culture phenomenons like Spice Girls and Austin Powers, there was a resurgence of late 60s and early 70s styles in the late 1990s. Big neon flowers, vinyl blow-up furniture, lava lamps, and indeed, the platform. This was a gleeful echo of the past, and my 11-year-old self had no idea that even calling back to the 70s was calling back to an earlier era. It doesn't take much for us these days, especially those of us who are into historical costuming or vintage style, to see where the inspiration came from in the earlier 20th century. I mean, who hasn't seen these absolutely luscious shoes from Ferragamo from the late 30s? But platform shoes have actually been around for centuries, and indeed throughout many different cultures. On that topic, please note that I'm going to limit my talk today to European fashion since that's what I know and what is for me to discuss. We will strictly be talking about feminine presenting clothing. Mask fashion, while full of nuance and delightful little nuggets of style, doesn't really change that much once you hit the turn of the 19th century, which is tragic, but I digress. Platform's biggest fashion moment can really be traced back to the Italian Renaissance, more specifically the 15th and 16th centuries in Venice. If you've never been there, Venice is built on a series of islands connected by canals. And whether you like the word or not, things can get pretty moist. So it's no surprise that feminine presenting people were looking for a way to keep their long dresses dry and sludge free. Sources are a little iffy about where the trend came directly from at the time. Pulled from the European practice of wearing pattens or wooden lifters that you put on over your shoes to keep them out of the mud, yes. Appropriated from Eastern cultures like Turkish bath shoes and Japanese geita, almost definitely. But being the fashionable ladies of the Renaissance, they took it one step further. Get it? Enter the reign of the chopine. Chopines are platform shoes that vary from the practical to the fabulous. They were slip-on and could go up to a whopping 18 inches tall. Look, y'all, I can barely manage a 3-inch heel these days. Can you imagine trying to walk on a cobbled street in 18-inch platforms? Needless to say, some of these more extreme chopines required the ladies to lean on their servants while they walked, so they could do so without falling on their Venetian faces. Okay, but where do the courtesans actually play into this? For a long time, we were mistaken in thinking that chopines were the mark of the working gal, the tooled leather of the trade, shall we say. Why didn't we think this? Well, patriarchy. This is gonna come up a lot in this video, so if you were the type to imbibe drink every time I refer to the patriarchy or misogyny, and if you don't imbibe, or like me, are watching this earlier in the day, sip your coffee or tea instead. Throughout time, as feminine presenting people dictated their own fashions, masculine presenting people felt threatened and emasculated and decided to try and reduce their power by mocking them. One very famous artwork is a print by Ferrando Bertelli titled Venetian Woman with Movable Skirt. It depicts a very fashionable woman dressed in a soutana, much like the one I'm wearing here, getting hit with a Cupid's bow. And then you can lift up her skirt to see what she's got on underneath. Of course you can. Another very famous depiction of Chopins in art also plays into the misogynistic assumption that this was, in fact, the costume of a courtesan. Carpaccio's painting Two Venetian Ladies features a red pair of Chopins in the left center of the painting, along with other suggestive and erotic symbolism littered throughout the painting. Of course, that has been debunked. The painting is actually the bottom half of a larger piece that shows that they're just ladies waiting for the boys to come home after hunting. But this concept of courtesans wearing Chopins was something that lasted for a very long time. In fact, Chopins were actually a symbol of status and wealth. Think about it. Who else can afford to have a servant walk by them so you can balance off of the top of their head so the bottom of your dress doesn't get dirty? Who else could afford extra yards and yards of fabric when fabric was extremely expensive to make a dress a foot longer than it actually needs to be so you can walk the streets and the palazios in your fancy long ass dress without looking like Steve Urkel? That courtesans wore Chopins was true. But like many other times and places, they were at basest mimicking what the ladies of high society were doing, and in some cases probably showing off their own wealth and success as independent women of means. Even today, if you've got a cool $300 laying around and live a life where you can justify wearing a pair of pure white shoes, you too can purchase a pair of Chopins so you can strut your stuff down in old New Orleans. I actually wouldn't recommend that. Bourbon Street is kind of gross. On a fun note, there is actually a pattern for Chopins in the 17th century women's dress patterns, book 2 by the V&A. It's 100% on my to make list just as soon as I can feasibly find a way to do it as somebody who doesn't know how to make shoes. Venetian Lady Gaga, anyone? Whew! We can at least be glad that the blue eyeshadow and the teased hair hasn't come back. It's a frustrating fact that for most of history, feminine presenting people have not had the freedom, power, or autonomy that masculine presenting people have. Patriarchal Western society has forced our femmes into roles of motherhood and trophies for most of history. One of the ways we have always found to fight back is through fashion. From large blio sleeves to the back off function of crinolines, femmes have taken control in one of the few ways that they could, by occupying space. There is something so powerful about wearing big, intentional clothing in public areas. Even today, when society is regressing, wearing some of these period styles out to even like the grocery store can command so much presence in a world where we're just expected to put baby in a corner. And while these silhouettes vary in so many ways, it's interesting to note that we go back to one very specific place every time we hit the 80s. It's like for 300 years, the end of the 70s roll around and they're like, okay ladies, time for big butts. It's the mid-1670s, and the long pointed bodies with large sleeves have been the dominant fashion for decades. But a new style has begun to emerge, and it is going to break everything. It started as a simple reception gown, something you could throw on to receive your friends when they came visiting without having to squeeze into those structured bodies. Known as the robe de chambre, this gown was loose, comfortable, and completely unstructured. Culturally appropriated from Eastern styles such as the Japanese kimono, of course, these gowns were loosely belted, and then they started to morph. The simple belt made way for simple pleating, and then more elaborate pleating, and then suddenly we have the mantua. And one of the most distinctive things about this gown, it was bustled up in the back, sometimes held up by buttons or hooks or even by the belt itself. The mantuas of the 1680s were our first foray into big buttdom, and y'all, it's such a great look. These skirts were augmented by something called a bum roll, albeit one that was considerably smaller than the ones we see earlier in the century. We are going to be making one of these soon on the channel, so that's something for you to look forward to. This style persisted for a good 30 years, despite Louis Couture's fighting it tooth and nail because he thought chicks looked hotter in these styles of his youth. This is sort of where court dress starts to lag behind popular fashion, although it's not fully disastrous until the next turn of the century. Also gonna be making one of those soon. Might already have started it. And then butts go out of fashion for a good part of the next century until the late 1770s. For decades, it was all about the hips. Wide-ish hips, even wider hips, giant hips. And then suddenly, nobody wanted hips, they just wanted butts. And much like everything else about the 18th century, they were bigger and floofier than anything we had ever seen before. This time, our skirt supports got an upgrade in the form of a bum pad. These could range in size and shape depending on your status and need, but we didn't stop there. We also bustled up the back of the skirts to give it more volume and more space. Predictably, the patriarchy hated it. And the butts only lasted about a decade before a series of revolutions changed the face of fashion entirely. By the 1790s, our bum pads had morphed into these sad little things, before getting completely dropped for a totally different silhouette. For a time, anyway. 1867. Crinolines have been keeping boys at bay for decades. But it's time for a change. Time for back. What we now call the first bustle era had commenced, and all that fluffy, frilly frou-frou had concentrated itself to the back of the dress. But wait, Jackie, you're saying that this is the late 60s and 70s. That's not the 80s. Okay, you're right. There is a small, slightly early resurgence of baby got back, and then suddenly there's nothing. A period of 5 years where butts are so not in. No butts here. Our form is natural, aesthetic. It's 1883 and there are no butts. Nah, wait, it's the 80s? Okay, butts are back in. The biggest butts of them all. Welcome to the 1880s, aka the second bustle era. Butts so big you could put an entire tea tray on them. Butts that occupy their own freaking zip code. By this time, fashion has evolved enough that there are many different kinds of support to give this fashionable shape. From the classic lobster tail bustle, to collapsible models, full-on foundation skirts, and even lightweight little bum pads for sporting events and more informal occasions. Tragically, despite the likes of Sir Mix-a-Lot and his contemporaries, the 1980s sort of dropped the BBL, if you know what I mean. Maybe those kids will bring them back in the 2080s. We can but hope. Also, if you're enjoying this video, please consider helping a gal out by taking another drink. I mean, hitting the like button and saying hello in the comments, or tell me what your favorite repeated fashion trend is. Whether it's one that I mentioned in this video or one that didn't make the cut. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't thank all of my supporters over on Ko-fi. Thank you for helping me run this channel. Times are tough and it is greatly appreciated. I have linked below if you would like to help contribute, but just by being here, you're helping out and I really appreciate it. Cheers. This next one, while maybe being one you're already familiar with and have probably worn at least once in your lifetime, might be my very favorite fashion trend of all time. And you may not be aware of exactly how popular a trend it really is. Power sleeves have been a thing forever, like the gorgeous Blio sleeves of the 12th century. But there is one type of power sleeve that shows up over and over and over again. Puffy sleeves! Okay, so if you've been here a while, first of all, thank you, you're my favorite. High five. You've probably noticed that we love a puffy sleeve here at Fantastical Follies. This shape has come in and out of fashion more, I think, than any other style. First, we've got the late Renaissance, my personal favorite era, the mid 17th century, the 1800s, 1810s, 1820s, 1830s, even a little bit into the 1840s. Then they get kind of boring for a few decades, then explode in the 1890s. And then they go really quiet until the 1980s. Of course, there are larger sleeve styles that are happening in between these puffy sleeve periods. For example, the pagoda sleeve of the 1850s, and there's definitely some fun stuff happening in the sleeve department in the 1930s. I find it actually quite interesting to take a look at the sleeve progression through every major era change. They tend to start out large, then get smaller, then gradually start to get larger again, and then the cycle repeats itself. That's not true for every instance, but it does kind of happen in a natural wave. A wave of puff. From a design standpoint, the puffy sleeves serve a purpose. That is firstly to balance out larger parts of the rest of the outfit. For example, if you have a big wide skirt and that's the only thing that's big, you're gonna look a little uneven. Adding big puffy sleeves will prevent you from looking silly. Well, less silly. It's interesting to note that even in periods of time where giant puffy sleeves aren't happening, we see this balance of design reflected in other elements of the style. For example, in the 1770s, right before the panniers drop, the giant big hips get balanced out with giant big hair and wooden ships. Naturally. Gotta love the 18th century. And when the silhouette changes, the hair changes as well. And it goes from being tall with the wide hips to being wide with the extended butt. What's crazy is that the hair does kind of the opposite thing in the 17th century. So in the 1660s, when the sleeves are big and puffy and the skirts are big and puffy, you get these Princess Leia curly hair bun things that are happening that echo that design. And when those sleeves change shape, so does the hair, and everything goes from being kind of wide to being long. But I digress. The other major reason we see this trend coming up over and over again is because it makes the waist look smaller. This is especially true for the earlier eras where corsets and waist reduction aren't really a thing yet. Like, I'm sure that's the main reason we get such a crazy silhouette in the 1830s when the sleeves were so very big, right? They were on the cusp of having that technology, but they weren't quite there yet. And so they had to balance it out. You have to remember in this late stage of capitalism that we have an unhealthy, sick mentality about fashion. How many of us have gone to a store and tried on a pair of, say, jeans, and they were too tight, and instead of going up to the next size, we just said to ourselves, well, we'll buy this pair and then lose 10 pounds and then they'll fit. That is so effed up, y'all. This is a modern concept that didn't really exist before the first part of the 20th century because they had puffy sleeves. Puffy sleeves will save humanity. All jokes aside, what we're really looking at here is an optical illusion. The large sleeves, the large skirts, all of the structural hip pads, bum pads, all that stuff existed to make our waists look smaller than they really were without causing us any discomfort or body issues. I think it's no accident that we see the absolutely ginormous sleeves come back into fashion after 70 years in the 1890s, because at this point we've mostly dropped our bustles and other hip structures. In that period of time, there was a big focus on health and how that related to women's bodies. That was tied up with the misinformation getting spread around with corsets and all that nonsense. That's a tangent for another day. But in short, we've dropped most of the bum support and are focused on comfortable clothing, but we still want the small waist. So naturally, the giant sleeves are back. Interestingly enough, I've noticed with historical costumers that you're either a big sleeve person or you're definitely not a big sleeve person. What does that say about us? I have a confession to make. I am a sucker for military details. Structured coats, gold braid, epaulets. My unbridled lust for these crisp, clean details have existed as long as I have had a sense of style. And I'm not the only one, because time and time again, we see masculine military details popping up in feminine styles, especially in periods of conflict. Insert current and topical political rant about certain leaders who are really ruining everything for everyone right now. There are a lot of periods that reflect this idea. For example, one of my favorite eras, the 1890s. In this period of time, we see an explosion of separates, especially in the form of suits. We start to get shirt waists with a waistcoat and a coat or jacket over top. Yeah, emulating the basic masculine suit. This comes at a period of time where industrialization is dominant, and more feminine presenting people are entering the workforce. So it's natural that their clothing becomes more practical, more adaptable, easier to wear, like mass clothing has been for a full century now, right? You also see this even earlier in the 19th century in sporting styles, where feminine clothing starts to mimic masculine clothing, because again, it needs to be more practical. I cannot imagine trying to swim in a bustle. Another iconic instance of mask style making its way into femme clothing is the riding habit. These start to pop up in the late 17th century, and the early styles are hyper reminiscent of the juice decor that the boys are wearing at the time. A long skirted coat with plenty of decorative braid and 10 gazillion buttons. Also, on a total side note, this period of time actually contains my favorite person in history, who is Monsieur Louis XIV's brother, the Duc d'Orléans. A very fascinating person. You should look him up if you are not familiar with him. Some very interesting things happening at the court of Louis XIV in the late 17th century, apart from the fashion. Anyway, it's this riding style in particular that mimics not only masculine clothing, but masculine military dress that we see popping up over and over again during times of war. In most cases, it was definitely intentional in a, support your troops sort of way. But I also think that in some instances, it was just a subconscious echo of what was happening at the time. If we fast forward about 80 years, there's some crap happening in Boston with some tea and some revolution. And then we see this begin to reflect in feminine dress in the shape of something called a redingote. Before the redingote, the military mask coat style was relegated strictly to riding. But it's in the 1780s that the redingote hits and it becomes something you wear on a daily basis. These are essentially skirted jackets with that military double-breasted styling. Again, we're seeing society shift in a way where feminine presenting people are looking for a more practical way to dress. What else happens in the 1780s? The French Revolution. More practical, informal looks reminiscent of masculine styles. One of my all-time favorite instances of this is the Regency Spencer. Probably why it's my life goal to have a Spencer in every single color of the rainbow. Spencers start to pop up in the 1790s. Are they a direct descendant of the redingote? Probably. They're cropped jackets, sometimes sleeveless, sometimes with long sleeved, sometimes double sleeved. But the distinctive feature of the Spencer and its long skirted sister, the pelisse, are military details, the very tailored style, the braid and trim on the front that mimic a red coat. What was happening in England in this period of time? The Napoleonic Wars. Lydia Bennet's obsession over the officers in Pride and Prejudice wasn't just some random thing. They're there because England is at war with France. And this isn't the only instance of that happening. I mean, who doesn't remember that sad time in the early 2000s when suddenly camo was in fashion? I mean, I never wore it. In the 1860s, we get something called a Garibaldi shirt, which was a red shirt inspired by the Italian folk hero Giuseppe Garibaldi and his wife, who wore red shirts in their military dress, and this became popular with all genders. In fact, this was basically the birth of the shirtwaist, or what we refer to now as a women's blouse. At the same period of time, feminine presenting people were also wearing something called a zouave jacket, which was directly inspired by French military dress. What was happening in the 1860s? As a side note, because y'all know I don't really know too much about Midvic, my friend Tiffany has a couple of videos where she gives a little bit of a deep dive into the history of these two pieces. So if you're interested in watching that, I have linked to them down below and you can check them out after this video. Finally, who could forget the World Wars? Think about feminine wartime fashion in the 19-teens and the 1940s. We're getting basic, practical, less frilly designs. It's this period of time where we start to move away from the corset into less structured undergarments. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. Starting in the 1930s and moving into the 1940s, trousers become a thing. Suits become a thing. Tweeds and khaki suits that mimic wartime uniforms. Everything is cyclical, not always for the better. Congratulations! You made it to the end of the video. You are awesome. Would you like to be even more awesomer? Then why not check out another video? YouTube is telling me you would love to watch this one. That's it for me. Thanks for watching. I love y'all, and I'll catch you in my next video.